from a slightly different perspective than the eminent gentleman on either side of me, not being in the authoring, writing kind of profession so much. Though I know you guys do a lot more than that too, but my role, whether it's being what I get paid for or the stuff I do in my spare time, has a lot around understanding systems and designing systems and hacking systems and building systems. And just a little about me. I mean, interestingly enough, I joined Standard & Poor's, joined the group that rated all of the CDOs of subprime mortgage securities. And I joined the group on the day that the Federal Reserve made the emergency interest rate cut. All hell broke loose, and the market basically exploded. So I've had a little bit of a ringside seat on some of the recent shenanigans in the marketplace. And so when Charles started talking about the trillions and the billions were big numbers, and now it's the hundreds of billions and the trillions. Between that going on and then really looking at the structure of money itself and understanding how meaningless the bits and pieces and the bits and the paper are, I've got to say I'm finding it really, really hard to keep a balanced budget these days. So I just don't believe in the shit out of it. It's a little bit of an occupational hazard. So yeah, I want to come at this from a little bit of a systemic perspective. Who here, can you just put a show of hands if I say Taoism and yin and yang, who's familiar with those kind of ideas and principles? That's pretty much everybody. For the few who didn't, the basic idea is anything that you look at can be broken down, and it's fundamental in the interaction between sort of the forces of yin and yang, which are primordial masculine and feminine, hot, cold, dark, light, etc. It's about the relation of dualities to each other. And a system that's functioning well from a Taoist perspective is a system that has yin and yang in balance with each other. And the Chinese and Chinese medical people are pretty good with this. They'll look at a body, again, talk about the story of separate, rather than coming in and it's like, oh, well, there's this thing that seems to be wrong right here. Well, if I give you the right molecule, it'll make this happen. It's like, wow, well, you seem to have a little bit of heat in your liver, and that seems to be causing your lung system to do that. And well, that's going to have that effect. So, I'm going to treat a whole system this way. And it's all about bringing things back into balance. It's not this idea that one pole, that there's this, again, these issues we had talking about Western spirituality, God, devil, this pole of moving in a direction towards an absolute. It's about balance. And when we look at our economic system, and look at our monetary system, we see a system that is way out of balance. And I'm going to speak in a little bit of story and metaphor here historically to talk about, yin and yang. So yin is sort of feminine. The generative and receptive aspects and real and solid, and the masculine. Yang represents kind of more abstract, more hierarchical, centralized, etc. Well, if we look at the earliest system of money that we actually have documentation on, it's the Sumerian and Babylonian shekel. And much as Doug was talking about, a shekel means bushel of wheat, and this was basically like a receipt for leaving your grain behind. Now the interesting thing about this receipt, this was a coin, that's how we still have record of it, the receipts that weren't metal we don't have anymore. It had on one side of it a bushel of wheat, on the other side it had a picture of the goddess, Inanna, Ishtar. Well, you could actually do two things with this coin. You could trade it in for grain back at the end of the year, and it was issued by the temple of the goddess. And the temple of the goddess, because she was in charge of fertility, of course, was the store of the grain. You could also trade it in on the feast days to spend time with the the people that we foolishly call temple prostitutes, the sacred priestesses who would have, who would be fertile with you at that point. And I love the fact that when we're talking about backing of currency, this started off backed by wheat and sex. Fertility, the two products of the goddess, and sex being female sexuality. And currency was controlled by the temple of the goddess and was this very feminine thing. Now, sweep through history, I'm not going to say money is driving the story or the story is driving money. They're co-evolving through history. So you go from the more matriarchal situation to the patriarchal cultures. It's the priest kings that start issuing the currency. The currency becomes centralized, kind of the realm. Instead of wheat and sex, it becomes gold. Interestingly, a very masculine sun symbol metal. We have this evolution then in the 1700s. We've reached the stage that paper currency is happening more. And then Isaac Newton, well-renowned alchemist, ends up taking over the Royal Mint. Many people don't know that Newton not only did all the gravity and optics business, but he's also basically responsible for a lot of the shape of the currency that we have today. Because he came up with a number of neat ideas like fractional reserve banking. And the reason he did this was because the English had a war to fight against the French, and we had run out of gold. And how do you pay the troops without gold? Well, alchemy, came up with this idea that, well, if you get the banks to issue and this, that, I'm not going to go into details. You can look it up if you don't know. You end up with 10 times as much gold as you started with fractional reserve banking. Interestingly enough, this, then everything up to Nixon choosing to leave the gold standard during the Vietnam War, you'll find most of the major innovations in currency design, certainly in the last 300 years or so, have happened during time of war. This is not an accident. Basically, our currency, I say our currency because fundamentally we may think there's lots of currencies in the world just because there are lots of different names for renminbis and dollars and euros, but fundamentally we have one currency system in the world which is, free-floating national currencies that are issued against debt and that have nothing backing them but the faith in God or the government or whatever else we choose to put faith in that story Charles was talking about. So, all of these, these innovations that have led us to our current monetary monoculture are basically innovations to make particular societies and their currency systems more competitive in times of war, or to support the cost of war. Very often this leads to hyperinflation and explosion of the currency system. In fact, what we have going on right now is a completely, unparalleled experiment, at least unparalleled in as much as the previous experiments to do things like what we're doing right now, in terms of printing money with no backing, basically end up with a whole, wheelbarrow of money situation we've all seen and, looks kind of funny in the pictures, but probably wouldn't be a lot of fun if we were actually dealing with that situation. So, from a systemic perspective, what's been happening here? Well, we have seen a move from, maximum yin, where the currency is basically men in service of the goddess bringing grain from their fields to the temple of the goddess, which issues the money.